Of course my neighbors decide that now is the perfect time to mow their fucking lawn. Hi! Hey! Hi! It's me, your Void, and today I have something book unrelated for you. If you have paid any attention to my header or my intro card, you know that I consume not just book but stories in general. And one way I do that is listening to a metric butt ton of podcasts, mainly horror, audio, drama podcasts. So I thought I'd make a little podcast spotlight series, I guess, in which I talk about my favorite podcasts to listen to. So that maybe if you want to get into podcast listening, you can listen to some good podcasts.
Statement begins.
I thought I'd start the series off with a podcast that I more or less mentioned before on this channel. Technically, I didn't mention the podcast, I mentioned the main character, you know, Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. But for the uninitiated, I might need to explain who this Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London, actually is. So, Johnny Boy, my namesake, is not only the guy who created the Magnus Archives as a podcast in real life, but it's also the name of the titular character of the Magnus Archives, which is a podcast distributed by Rusty Quill and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 4.0 international license. Or rather, a horror podcast. So, the Magnus Archives is a horror audio drama podcast. The first part of this podcast is more of a podcast, and then later on the audio drama part comes in. It is a total of 200 episodes long, spread out over 5 seasons. Each episode is somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes long, so nice and bite-sized. And in this podcast, we follow the titular character of Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute in London. And he, in season 1, when we start this whole shebang, he just became head archivist of the Magnus Institute London, and now he has to sort through all of the files and stuff that was left behind by the person who had this job before him, just that the person before him apparently didn't do a really good job at sorting everything, and the actual archiving part kind of fell down a very deep hole. So he's trying to sort through some shit. He has a whole team for it, consisting of Sasha, who is actually an archival person, like she knows how to archive stuff. Then we have Tim, who is the sassiest queen of all sassy queens. We love Tim. And we have Martin, who's just there. John doesn't like him. You know. And John is really trying his best to figure out how to work through this archive. His main mission is to digitalize all the paper files for safekeeping, but there are some tech issues, so after fiddling around a bit, he resorts to voice recording all of the files he finds down in the archives. And these files talk about strange and borderline supernatural events that happened to people. And these people come to the Magnus Institute to report on these events. So John is reading about these events, and he is a full-blown skeptic. He reads all these statements, he narrates them. Those are the episodes in the first season where he's just reading these files and then he is giving his opinion on them. He mainly calls everyone absolutely fucking insane for thinking all of this is real, and then he just files it away and is done with it. But the further we go into the season, the stranger the things that happen become, and at one point they stop happening on the page and they start happening in the archives, and we go from there.
Statement of Joe Spooky regarding sinister happenings.
I wanted to start with this specific podcast because A, it is a podcast that I technically have mentioned on this channel before, and B, this is the one podcast that got me into podcasts in the first place. I was never a person to listen to audio dramas, to podcasts, to audiobooks. I always needed some sort of visual input, but at one point I was just like, yeah, fuck it, I'm gonna listen to this. So I pressed play on episode 1, Anglofish, and maybe I should not have listened to this on my way home from school at 6 p.m. I distinctly remember it was a fall season because it was already dark at 6 p.m. So I was there on my bike heading home through a forest listening to a very creepy podcast. It was perfection. I fell in love and I listened to all 200 episodes in the following months. Technically years, because when I started listening, season 4 and 5 weren't out yet, so they were still in production, so there were big pauses. Anyways, I'm rambling. I love this podcast. I listened to it, and from there, my love for horror podcasts was sparked. And now here we are. I'm making a video about it. So this podcast feels like a little horror story anthology. So each episode is just a short story. Just a creepy, not necessarily even horror. Just something is weird about every single story, and every single episode has one of these stories in the first season. But we quickly leave this anthology state of the podcast because the longer you listen to this podcast, the more you see certain patterns emerge and you start to make connections between things. So it's going places. You just have to stick with it. But even if you don't stick with it, you get a bunch of really cool horror short stories. And then you reach the point where everything just clicks into place and you are suddenly confronted with this much larger picture that is so much more terrifying than the little stories. Again, I really love this fucking podcast, okay?
Melanie King recording, apparently. So, marker?
The cast, the characters, the whole production team behind it. It started with 2 people literally recording under a blanket in their bedroom. Now it's a whole company that is also producing other podcasts. But the Magnus Archives itself, the cast, the crew, it's all incredibly diverse and it shows in everything they do. Like their whole work it's everything is incredibly diverse. The people who are voicing these characters are so incredibly talented. It's ridiculous. The hype around this podcast is incredibly justified. The fandom has so much passion, and I would actually argue it's one of the least toxic fandoms in existence. I myself have cosplayed the Ratman himself. If you know, you know.
You spent 50,000 on shoes. Well, you haven't seen the shoes.
If you don't know, you need to listen to the podcast.
You know, you're talking a lot of shit for someone with 2 perfectly good eyeballs, each priced at about $762 on the black market.
And now there is even a spin-off / sequel thing happening called the Magnus Protocol. I also have mentioned that on my channel before. If you watched one of my Adventure-a-thon vlogs, I listened to the first episode. And I listened to, I think, 3 or 4 episodes, and then I decided, nope, this is not working for me. I need to wait until the whole season is out. I like to binge listen to a whole season of a podcast. I'm just not made for waiting a week for a podcast episode. I'm fine with waiting a week for a show to happen. I'm not so good at waiting a week for a podcast. I tried a couple of times and I lost every single thread there was. I had to re-listen to another podcast season because I just couldn't follow on a weekly basis, so I had to binge listen to the whole thing once it was out. So I'm waiting for the Magnus Protocol to be done with season 1 to listen to that one. Technically, I guess you could listen to the Magnus Protocol without listening to the Magnus Archives. but just from the couple of episodes I've listened to, it would help if you listen to the Magnus Archives first. I am going to listen to the Magnus Protocol 100% because I really want to know what is happening after the finale that was episode 200 of the Magnus Archives, because oh my god, this episode had me go no, and actively gasp in the middle of a forest because I was walking the dog. Let's just say the pupper was so confused about what I was doing. But he enjoyed it because we had an extra long walk, so if you now want to listen to the Magnus Archives after I literally told you nothing about it except pure chaos and that I really like it, you can do so. Be aware, this is a horror podcast, so there are all of the trigger warnings, but if you need more specific information, they do have extensive trigger warning lists for every single episode, and full transcripts are available on their website and everything. They have a really good organized wiki, so if you can't listen to an episode, you can read the summary, you can read full transcripts of every episode, and if you miss some of these connection points that I mentioned earlier, they are also listed on the wiki. However, I would urge you not to look at those connection points and to avoid spoilers for the earlier seasons, because you will have questions that can't be answered by listening to the show. All of these connection points make sense in hindsight. They make sense in the later seasons. They do not make sense if you are in season 1. It's a gradual build, and I would say if you know what's happening from the get-go, you will not enjoy it as much as you would when you listen to it completely blind. My recommendation, go in blind, and if you miss any connection points, look into it later, once you reach like season 3, I'd say. In season 3, things are suddenly popping into place and whoa, taking off places. So yeah, that's my short little introduction thingy to the Magnus Archives as a podcast. I plan on making more of these podcast spotlights in the future, but until then, happy listening! Bye!
Statement ends.